All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to KSU's Research with Relevance Friday Features. We are back again for the second episode. I think this might be the third episode of Chairs and Directors Showcase this semester. And today I'm happy that we are featuring Dr. Aniruddha Bagchi, Interim Chair of the Department of Economics, Finance, and Quantitative Analysis in the Coles College of Business. My name is Phaedra Corso, and I'm Vice President for Research at Kennesaw State University. And our goal with these Friday features, as you all are aware of by now, is for us to stay connected to each other as research scholars and colleagues, and to learn about the great research that is happening around KSU that we might not ordinarily hear about if we don't step outside of our offices. And I'm just super thrilled to spend some time with Dr. Bagchi today. Because he does research in an area that I actually do a little bit, not as extensively as he does, and so I think it will be a wonderful conversation. So a few housekeeping tips before we begin. Please make sure that your mics stay muted if you're not speaking. If you want to focus on a specific speaker, I know you all are experts when it comes to Teams by now, but if you want to focus on a particular speaker, you just click on the three dots by that person's name. This episode will be recorded and will be available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel sometime over the weekend or next week. And we'll be watching a video, and at the end of the video, I'll start off with a few questions, but I hope that those of you who are listening to this live will jump in and ask some questions as well. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. So Dr. Bagchi, as I mentioned before, is the interim chair. He's been at Kennesaw State University for over a decade, and he joined KSU in 2006 as an assistant professor. His background is in economics, and it led him to do research that now investigates the impact of economic factors on homeland security. So a very timely and relevant area of research. So during Research with Relevance, Dr. Bagchi will specifically discuss the economic aspects and influence on airport and port security. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Megan to show us the video.
Bagchi, currently the Interim Chair of the Department of Economics, Finance, and Quantitative Analysis. I received my Ph.D. in Economics from Vanderbilt University and have been at KSU for around 15 years. My initial research was in industrial economics. However, from around 2010, I gradually developed an interest in homeland security. A few years after the September 11 attacks, there was a steep increase in the relative share of the expenditure on homeland security. Some economists noticed this, and a few papers on the cost-benefit analysis of such expenditures were published after 2010. The papers showed that the United States was spending an excessive amount on security. I was interested in those issues. However, since diversifying into a new research area was a risky venture, I kept on procrastinating. During this time, a former student of mine got in touch with me and asked me if I would like to involve him on any of my research projects. We had a long discussion, and he decided to write a paper in this area. In the process of mentoring him, I started reading the literature and developed some concrete ideas to pursue. In my recent research, I have looked at how improving intelligence capabilities can improve the cost-benefit ratio of security policies. Computing the total cost of security is complex. This is because there are several indirect costs that must be factored in. Money spent on security could alternatively have been spent elsewhere, such as on education or healthcare. This must be accounted for. It also includes the value lost due to higher processing time at ports or airports, and even non-monetary aspects such as privacy. My paper on airport security considers the interaction between better quality information about passengers and screening policies. The model also factors in how terrorists are likely to adapt to security policies. To prevent terrorists from gaming the system, we find that a smart strategy for the TSA is to act randomly. An interesting prediction is that after an improvement in the quality of intelligence, the frequency of attacks will go down, but the successful ones are likely to have a high impact. The threat of terrorist attacks also compels ports to rigorously inspect cargo. This can lead to congestion and increases processing time in ports. Therefore, the US Customs and Border Protection introduced a trusted trader program called CityPad, similar to the PreCheck program that is used in airports. Firms that join CityPad are required to ensure an acceptable level of security of their entire supply chain. And in exchange, they enjoy priority processing in the port. I have a paper on how better quality intelligence can improve the CityPad program. If I have to pick my favorite insight from that paper, it is the prediction that the government underspends in intelligence relative to the level that could have minimized congestion in ports. I also wrote a paper on cybersecurity with a colleague of mine in the Information Systems Department. In this paper, we consider a situation in which a possible cyber attack on a service provider can shut it down and harm other firms in the economy. Given this setting, we examine if the government should take over the cybersecurity of all critical service providers. The answer is that this is not necessarily the case. Under some circumstances, such a takeover indeed makes sense, but this is not universally true. In subsequent research, I extended some of these ideas in other contexts, such as the case of possible human rights violations. I have written papers on other aspects of national security also. For example, I am currently working on some projects related to the economic impacts of conflict. Every year, Coles College organizes a Homeland Security Symposium, and I present my current research in that forum. I am grateful to KSU for providing a great research environment that allowed me to focus on my research.
Great, thank you. And welcome, Dr. Bagchi.
Thank you.
And also, before I forget, let me also say a big thank you to Megan, who who has effortlessly taken over the development of these videos and is now our official only StratCom person and in the Office of Research, and she's doing a great job. So thank you to Megan. All right, let's just jump right into it. I could ask you a million questions. This type of research is so fascinating and so timely right now. I just attended a meeting last week sponsored by the USG on research security, and we talked about cyber attacks for 2 days straight. So it's gotten me my wheels going on this topic. So what if you could first help a layperson understand your methods? Cost-benefit analysis, can you give us a little bit of an understanding of kind of what falls in a cost column and what falls in a benefits column for one of your models?
Absolutely. So let me start with the cost side. So typically, the way we think about security is just to look at the dollar expenditure on security. But that's certainly not enough. There are many other indirect costs, and in my opinion, they're actually the more interesting things to consider. So one of them is if you are spending money on, let's say, security, then you are essentially diverting resources from alternative uses, such as on education or healthcare. So if you spend too much money on security, it is possible that you will have poor quality health of your citizens, or maybe you will have to make some steep cuts in your universities. And that's really not very ideal for an economy in the long run. So all of those opportunities, so those are typically known as the opportunity costs, and they have to be factored in. There is
Before you move on, Dr. Bagchi, let me just ask you. I totally agree with you. I think as someone who cares about health policy, I don't just want policy for policy's sake. It has to be balanced with everything else that we do. But how do you operationalize that, or how do you quantify that opportunity cost?
okay, yeah. So there are, you know, certain kinds of methods that we can use that can tell us, let's say, what will be the economic impact of a $1 cut in healthcare expenditure, or what is the economic impact of a $1 cut in, let's say, education expenditures. So so once you know the impact of, let's say, a dollar cut on expenditures on the other areas, and you can sort of figure out the long run economic impact of those cuts, you will have a fairly good idea about how, let's say, an extra dollar spending on security is going to affect your economy elsewhere. Okay.
Got it.
Uh,
Thank you.
Now, coming to that, there was one other point I was going to mention regarding the costs of security. So there are some time costs involved as well. So let's say you are in the airport and there are long lines and you have to, waste long times in the airport. Now that means that you will have less time to work. Maybe your plan was to go and attend a conference somewhere, and if the airport lines move very smoothly, you don't have to budget for a lot of time for your entire travel. But if there are lots of uncertainties in the airport, you will probably have to spend an extra day somewhere else. So those things build up. So the time costs, they can be for individuals in the airports, or when we are importing goods, then if they are stuck in the ports for a long time, then they are going to cost the importers a lot of money, and those can actually be fairly substantial. So that, if you try to inspect everything, then there are significant time costs associated with that. And to the extent that time as money, that also is costly to the economy.
Okay, good. And so in your research with the TSA, with airport security in particular, so you found that the random searching was the best method, and I'm sure that has to do with the time delays, but also the personnel that's available to do those searches. Did you find anything else interesting in that model?
Yes. First of all, the question is, when you do random inspections, should we use the same probability of inspection for every kind of individual? That was certainly an important question we asked in the paper. And the answer is no. The probability that a person will be asked to appear for, let's say, a special check, that can vary on various kinds of factors, and it depends upon the intelligence inputs that we have about that person, and it also depends upon whether we have information about, let's say, certain kinds of terrorist groups or whatever they are planning to do at that point of time. So what happens is that different individuals will have different probabilities of being selected for screening. And that is one way the government can save money, by actually not trying to, let's say, screen a person with the same probability. Now, what we found is also that when you spend money in intelligence gathering, then any adversary, they can be terrorist groups or they can also be a hostile foreign nation. The point is, those adversaries will also react to it. So what they will do is that if they know that a particular country has a very good, let's say, intelligence infrastructure, they are unlikely to attempt attacks that will have only a moderate impact. So you are going to see very few attacks very few successful attacks that have a moderate impact. But the point is that even those adversaries, they can plan some, let's say, attacks with real high impact. And even if you have good intelligence, it is still never perfect. So occasionally some of those attacks will slip through. And so if you look at the data, what you will see over time is that there is a certain kind of skewness where the successful attacks will seem to have very high impact, but otherwise the total number of attacks will certainly be much lower if you have good quality intelligence.
So, the intelligence information provides probabilities. How is that different than, racial profiling or ethnic profiling? I don't know. I explain that to me.
Okay. See, the point is, if you try to base your probabilities only on the basis of the race of a person or the religion of a person, then you will be making a major mistake. And let me give a real world example. So this shoe bomber, Richard Reed, when he was getting into the airplane on that day, one flight attendant noticed that there was something wrong about that person. His behavior did not seem to be right. So she asked him to show her his boarding card. He showed, so she checked on his name. It appeared to be, a perfectly, you know, let's say the right kind of name. So she asked him a few questions. He answered them correctly. So she did not find any hard evidence against him. And since that person seemed to fit the right kind of profile, she just, let him go. The point is, if you have some kind of a rule that a certain ethnic group will be subject to a lower chance of screening, then terrorists, they will be able to game the system very easily. So if you have to make the security system really effective, the key feature is that it should be unpredictable. So regardless of your race, religion, whatever be the case, you will still be subject to any kind of screening.
Okay,
Okay.
got it. Got it. So is it the case that all airports across the globe are following that same logic with this randomness?
Uh, to a large extent, yes, but the point is that once you go out of the developed world, their intelligence capabilities are not that good. So then what if they really don't have any information to distinguish one person from the other one, then what they will have to do is sort of go for some kind of a uniform policy. They will still do, do some random special checks, but the chance that if they have no information, then the probability of any person being called for inspection will always be the same. But if you are looking at developed countries, well, they have better intelligence infrastructure, so they can go for random inspections, but there even the probability of calling a person, they can tweak it a little bit depending upon whatever they know about that person. So random inspections, well, to some extent it is followed in many countries in the world, but how well it is done, it varies quite a lot from one country to another.
Good. All right. So here's a question for you. So when I traveled over the Christmas, the December break, I traveled to a country that did quote unquote random COVID testing when we got off the plane. Do Has there been research on whether that really is a random process? Because it didn't appear random to me. They called it random because I think that's the only way we wouldn't revolt, but it didn't feel like it was random. So are you seeing that same pattern with COVID testing or no?
Look, I haven't, done research with COVID testing, but I cannot really uh, give an answer on the basis of any research that I've done. But I can tell you give you an answer on the basis of what I know from the media. So the point is that based upon several kinds of factors, it is quite possible that they might identify that you are let's say, a higher risk individual. So the probability that they will, you know, ask you for a special COVID test or COVID screening might be higher than some other person. Now, that other person may look the same to you, but there can be several other unknown factors that may not all be known to you. So even though it might seem as if it is discriminatory, but it may not always be the case because you may not always have all of the information.
Good, thank you. I think that's the best way that you can answer it. All right, let's talk about your port modeling. I don't remember hearing this on the video, but did you determine that the randomness of the inspection also exists in the port? And so should we just assume that in any kind of entry, whether it be walking across the border of Canada and Mexico, that randomness is always going to be the optimal strategy?
Yes, in general, that's the case. So in the language of game theory, we call this mixed strategy equilibriums. So, and basically what happens in these cases is that the security provider uh, decides to inspect with a certain probability for everyone. So it turns out that yes, that is the nature of the equilibrium in most of the models that we have worked out. In any kind of inspection, typically this is what you are going to see. And the logic is very simple. So let's say you decide to, so let's take a very simple example. So the case of tax audit, since we are so close to the tax date. So let's say you have a great history of submitting your taxes in time, and you suppose you compute your taxes perfectly. But the point is that the IRS does not know that, so the IRS has to make sure that everyone complies with the tax laws. So one strategy it can use to sort of make sure that everyone complies is to audit everyone. In that case, of course, no one is going to, make any kind of mistakes in their taxes, but then the IRS will spend a lot of time doing those audits. The other extreme case will be where the IRS decides not to audit anyone. In that case, well, people are going to, they are going to then maybe cheat a little bit on their taxes. So if you have to strike a fair balance about the chance of catching, those who haven't filed their taxes properly versus the cost of inspection, then the best way out is to randomize. So then you appear unpredictable, and then people, since they don't know whether they will be asked for an audit, will be forced to basically file their taxes properly.
So what I like about your your argument is that kind of from the macro perspective, right? It should be random, but from the micro perspective, when I'm being audited, there's no way that I think that's the policy making.
Yes. See, even in my own life, what I noticed is when I was on a student visa, every time I used to go to the airport, well, most of the times I was asked to appear for a special check. Okay, after I got a job and my visa status changed, then suddenly the chance of getting audited in the airport also went down. So I can reasonably guess that the type of the visa is a factor in that or in the decision to, let's say, screen a person. But I don't think that there was any kind of discrimination involved in any case. It's just that they think that someone on a student visa is a higher risk individual, so they are probably going to screen more of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So we do have a hand up, but I'm going to ask you one more question. I read one of your papers on cyber terrorism and cyber warfare, which I found super fascinating. Again, because this topic is kind of in my head this week. But my question for you is, how do you account for in your modeling for quality of intelligence? And that really applies to all of your papers, because you account for the dollars that one is investing in the intelligence, but that doesn't equate to quality, does it?
No. The quality basically there are two, or there are multiple ways of defining the quality of intelligence. So one is that if you have let's say there is something called the type of an individual, and we can think of the type as continuous or discrete. So if it is continuous, then there is a one kind of measure we use, but that will be hard to explain today. But let me just, go for the case where the type of an individual is discrete. That's much easier to explain. So let's say that a particular adversary has a plan of attack, okay, or basically is trying to devise a plan of attack, but you are the defending country. You are not sure whether they have a viable plan of attack or not. So you spend money in intelligence trying to find out whether they do have a plan or not. Now, when you get the intelligence report, well, it is going to tell you something, but there is a chance that there will be some kinds of errors. And errors can go both ways. The intelligence report can tell you that they have a viable plan when in fact they don't have it, or the converse is also true. So there can be both a missed alarm and a false alarm. And when we talk about the quality of intelligence, basically what we try to find out is we will say that the intelligence quality is better if the, let's say, chance of getting a wrong report is lower.
I got it. So it's a parameter in your model, and you don't necessarily have the data behind that parameter, but you vary it.
Yes. So this is basically, since this is a theoretical model, we ask so we define what is meant by a better quality intelligence, and then we ask, well, if this, suppose the government spends more money and improves, let's say, the fidelity of the intelligence report, then what will be the impact on, let's say, the economy or its security policy and so on. The reason why we don't actually in future, if we can, we would love to do some empirical follow-up work on this. The whole problem is that many of those things are classified information, so we won't even know many of this information. So best thing we can do is look at some research done already and maybe get some additional data and run some simulations. That's probably the best we can do for the time being.
Great, great. Tyler, you had your hand up?
I did. Thank you so much for this. And I'd like to ask a question related to the optimal allocation of resources on screening versus intelligence. And this is a question that's largely going to kind of focus on American federalism. So forgive the exceptionalism in the form of the question here. But when we think about screening, it seems intuitive that that demands a lot more physical space than intelligence would. And when we think about the American structure of government, particularly American federalism, the screening is largely a federal function, the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, but the ownership, the funding, the operations of airports are largely sub-federal. So decisions about capital spending and facility expansion are largely driven, in the case of Atlanta, Hartsfield, Jackson, by the city government, or in the case of JFK and LaGuardia, it's driven by the Port Authority, which is a state agency, not a federal agency. So when we think about that optimal allocation, how much of it do you see as being driven by this kind of intergovernmental dynamic where perhaps a city or state agency that owns and is responsible for funding the space at the airport isn't providing necessarily what the TSA and the federal government would want in terms of the space allocation for screening?
Okay. That's a good question, and actually there are some issues that we had in the original version of the paper, but then the referee basically asked us to sort of downplay some of those things so they do not appear in the final version of the paper. So the issue that we brought up is that a government is not necessarily one single entity. So there are multiple agencies involved, and even at the federal level, when you look at security, there is always a tension between the Department of Treasury, which provides the money, and the, let's say, Department of Homeland Security. Plus, you bring another layer, which is, let's say, the local government. So yes, so I think this literature can be extended to capture the interagency, let's say, tensions as we go along. But in the paper that that was presented in the video, in that case, we basically lumped everything together as the government. We pretended as if there is no tension between, different agencies. Okay.
That's great. And if I can ask one follow-up, and this one is more just kind of me as the traveler. Do you see any kind of distinction from that physical capital perspective when you have an airport like, say, Hartsfield Jackson, where you have a singular security checkpoint and access to the entire airport, versus one where you have individualized and kind of fragmented security demands like a Miami or an LAX, where you have 9 or 10 unique security checkpoints? Does that disaggregation put any strain or change that optimal allocation of resources in the intelligence versus screening?
Yes, so ultimately what matters is what is the probability that they will be able to detect a potential hijacker in an airport. Now, typically what airports try to do is they do tend to have multiple layers. And if they think that, you know, they have one really robust layer and that will be enough to, you know, to catch all kinds of hijackers, that will work good enough. But there can be, you know, but it is possible that in a different airport, they might think that, well, maybe having multiple layers is a better way to go. So ultimately what matters is what is the probability that there is a breach of the screening system in the airport. If some airport can achieve that in one layer, well, fine. If they cannot, then they need to go for multiple layers.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tyler. So I'm going to go back to one of your papers that I read this week, and that's the one on cyber warfare and cyber terrorism. I'd like for you to, first of all, explain to us what's the difference between those two terms, because I don't think I knew that before I read the paper. And then I'd like to just get your professional opinion about, you know, what do you see as the major issues that we need to deal with in those topics based on your theoretical model?
Okay. So one major difference is that when it comes to cyber terrorism, it is usually, you know, acts of terror done by non-state actors. Whereas when you are looking at cyber warfare, then it is basically some kind of cyber attacks done by hostile foreign nations. And you can guess that as far as the intensity is concerned, well, when there is some major act of cyber warfare, then probably we have more to worry because the foreign nation is likely to have more resources at its disposal. So, so now coming to the major areas of concern. So first of all, cyber warfare can generally be used to make sure that there is some kind of major equipment malfunction in a foreign country. So let's say that a foreign country decides to, let's say, damage one of your power plants, or, you know, create some major problem in some nuclear facility. Then that can have some immediate, you know, effects, but more importantly, there can be lots of spillover effects because many of those attacks can be on infrastructural firms which provide vital inputs to other sectors of the economy. So if an electrical plant is thrown out of gear, then basically several other factories that depend on that will also not be able to function. And in order to pull off this kind of attack, the adversary does not have to be within your physical borders. They can, you know, do those attacks even from outside. And so it will be very hard to even catch or prosecute them. So the best thing to do is make sure that you have strengthened your defenses and you follow the chatter that is going on to try to, you know, stop them before those kinds of attacks happen. Now it can cut both ways. So there is this famous case of the Stuxnet virus. So what happened was, as you know that, well, Iran, it was developing the nuclear weapon. At least there are enough reasons to believe that they were spending a lot of money in developing an actual nuclear weapon. And a few years back, what happened was some of their equipment started to malfunction. And in fact, some of their scientists also died as a result of, you know, certain accidents in their laboratories. Now, there are strong reasons to believe that those were actually engineered by US and Israeli intelligence agencies. Now, the point is that none of these countries had to send any individual inside Iran to actually, you know, carry out any of those attacks. So you could actually slow down their bomb making process just by controlling some things from outside. Now uh, the whole issue is that this can be used as a weapon to, to maybe stop some kind of foreign adversary. But on the other hand, foreign adversaries can also use this same weapon against us to sort of harm us in a major way. So, so as far as cyber weapons are concerned, I think the major problem is that you are unlikely to see the, the actual perpetrator within your country. Whatever happens can all happen from outside the country.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. So in thinking about cyber terrorism or cyber warfare that hits, our energy grid as an example. So then whose responsibility is it to protect that energy grid, right? That's a private sector company, but what you're talking about is macro level impacts to our entire economy. So if I run Georgia Power, maybe that's not a good example, is it the government's responsibility to protect me, or should I be using those resources?
Yeah, so that's an important issue that was actually considered in the paper. So what happened is that if you look at the case of airport or port security, then essentially the entire security is controlled by the government. They are in charge of collecting the intelligence and then they decide what to do with that information. In the case of cybersecurity, since there are so many private firms involved, the government is not really in charge of the whole process. So what it does is it sort of, certainly it has intelligence capabilities. So it sort of monitors the chatter or tries to find out whether any particular adversary is planning to carry out an attack. So then what it can possibly do is pass on that information to a private firm and warn it that, well, it is going to be the likely target. So it needs to beef up its defenses. Or if the firm is unable to do it on its own, then the government can step in to help. So one counterfactual question we asked over there is there any reason to believe that security will be better if the government took over all the entire function of providing cyber security? And the answer we found is that no, that is not necessarily the case. Uh, so under some situations, yes, if the government takes over everything, certainly security will be better. But there are many other situations also where the government will do just as well simply by passing on those inputs to the private firms, and it will be in their own interest to sort of act on that information.
But so, I read that paper a couple of times. It's pretty technical. So explain to me, the way that I read it was, if the government spends a little bit of money, not a lot of bit of money, on intelligence, and perhaps collects intelligence that's not that great and passes on a lot of noisy intelligence, they might as well not be in the game at all. Am I reading that right?
Yes, actually that plays out in, a few other papers as well. So some of those papers were not presented in the video, but generally one insight I found is that if your intelligence capability is, let's say, fairly poor, and the kind of report you get is really not much better than a coin toss, then intelligence really does not add any kind of significant value. In order for intelligence to start having any kind of bite, it has to be significantly good. And
all right, but let me push back on you a second, right? So if I run intelligence for the United States, I think that, arrogantly, we think we're doing the best that we can and we have the best intelligence. It's almost like you don't know how the quality of your intelligence until it's too late. So if you were providing consultation to the United States, what would you tell them? What is the threshold? And how do they know if they're providing the best intelligence possible?
yes, so first of all, in order to find that out, then we will need access to lots of classified information. But I can tell you some things that we can find from open source data. So one kind of attacks that we rarely talk about are foiled terrorist attacks. So, and at one time, I actually tried to get, collect systematic information on terrorist or hostile attacks that were actually foiled. And the point is, there aren't that many of them. So there were some attacks that were really planned, but they were, stopped in their tracks at some point of time. And the fact that until now, after September 11, there hasn't been too many high impact terrorist attacks. So that also tells us that the intelligence system seems to be working over here. It may not be, the best possible thing, but it is sufficiently better than, or it is sufficiently good to sort of stop the attacks that we are likely to face.
So let's talk about that data source. Do you actually believe what's been provided to the public is actually what's happening?
They don't provide all of the information, but the point is that there are some, think tanks that have much better access to the intelligence community than what I have. Okay, and sometimes they produce those reports. And there are, very few reports that talk about those kinds of foiled attacks and how they were, detected and so on. But there are a few, and I looked at some of those studies. And based upon, whatever I read from those foundations, so Rand Corporation, for example, it often publishes lots of reports on foiled terrorist attacks, and they do have, good connections with the intelligence community. So I'm inclined to believe their feedback on, let's say, the number of foiled attacks. And trust me, there are not too many of them. So I counted it was around 50 over the last maybe, let's say 10 years or something around that. So it's not too many.
Okay, good. All right, Tyler has his hand up again.
Plenty of questions to throw out there. And I kind of want to take from that question that Phaedra had just asked and kind of get back to a nuts and bolts question about both the trusted trade program that you wrote about in the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, as well as the PreCheck program that you talked about as kind of the trusted traveler program on the airport security, and thinking about the financial aspects of that. Looking at the TSA budget in particular, only about a third of TSA operational spending is coming from those user fees. So what we pay when we book an airline ticket, as well as the $85 that we as PreCheck members would pay for a 5-year membership. And perhaps this is getting into more of a behavioral economics question on the part of travelers and also on the part of companies that are involved in trade and importing and exporting. But at what point are we compromising any sort of security, whether it be in the form of trade or in the form of travel and security in the airs, for these trusted traveler or trusted trade programs? Is there a threshold? To me, as an individual, it seems like $85 for a 5-year membership in PreCheck or 5-year trusted traveler in PreCheck. I'd be willing to go probably 2, 3, 4 times that for the value that I get out of it as a fairly regular traveler. So where, from a behavioral standpoint, do you think that breaking point sits?
Yeah, so I won't be able to give you any dollar amount, but let me talk about some of the issues related to PreCheck. So suppose you decide to go for PreCheck. So first of all, it means, just any individual will not, try to go for PreCheck. You will try to do it only if you have a clean record. So the fact that you are, trying to go register for that program means that you are signaling to the government that you have a clean record. So that's one vital piece of information. Okay. Now you will, once you are in the program, then you will make sure that you keep on having a clean record so that you can renew your status every time. So the government also gets that information. Now, so they know that here are some self-selected people who have every incentive to keep a clean record. And so the government can afford to actually save some money by reducing the inspection probability of those individuals. So the benefit from the PreCheck, well, it partly comes in the form of fees, but a larger part comes from the reduced rate of inspections of these individuals. Okay, and that's a huge amount. When it comes to the trusted trader programs, well, again, signing up for a trusted trader program, as far as the fees are concerned, is really not that much. But as an importer, if you sign up for it, then it means that you are committing to maintain a certain standard of your supply chain security. So you will be making the investments to secure your supply chain. And had you not done that, then the government would have been forced to inspect 100% of the cargo. But if lots of importers sign up for this program, then the government is actually, it is able to reduce the inspection intensity of a certain group of importers. And there it saves a ton of money. So the point is that these kinds of trusted trader or trusted traveler programs, ultimately it saves money because you will have to do less inspection.
That's great, and I know you can obviously we can measure the user fees that are generated from both the taxes charged on an airline ticket and from the $85 membership on the trusted traveler side, at least in PreCheck. Are there studies out there on the cost savings that, in the case of air travel, the TSA has realized as a result of membership in PreCheck?
Yes, so there are some kinds of studies. So there is a person, Professor Jacobson from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He was here actually 2 years back, and he had done some work over there. Now, one thing we have to admit in this kinds of work is we do have some kind of information from open source, and he consulted for Homeland Security, so he has access to more information, but still he does not have all of the information. So some of the results are you can only simulate because, well, we will never have access to classified information. But even with those simulations, there are reasons to believe that on the net, these things make a lot of sense.
I'm going to follow up on Tyler's question on the ports. So in that program where I can, as a, someone who has a company bringing items through the port and I sign up for this program, if I'm a terrorist or I'm trying to do harm, why wouldn't you just focus on those suppliers? Like, it seems to me like you could somehow or another infiltrate those that have been cleared, pre-cleared, as now you've given me a new way to come in.
Yes, but the point is that there is also, that is why these kinds of programs, first of all, they are combined with, or for them to work, you need good intelligence capabilities. So the intelligence agency will keep on monitoring the terrorist groups or all kinds of bad actors. And if they try to, if they are planning to do something or if they target a firm, chances are that the intelligence community will be aware of that. So what they need to do is pass on the information to that importer that their supply chain is under risk. Now think of the importer. Well, you know that there are lots of benefits you can get by being a trusted trader. It saves you time at the port. Now, if there is any breach in your supply chain, then you will lose all of those privileges. So as an importer, you are more likely to take those warnings very seriously. So actually breaching the supply chain won't be so easy as long as the government keeps on passing those inputs to these traders in time.
Okay, good. So I don't want to switch gears completely. I do want to encourage folks who are listening to jump in if you have questions. But in the meantime, I want to ask you, Dr. Bagchi, what are you working on now, or what do you want to study next?
Okay, good question. Actually, there are several projects that I am working on currently. So today, actually, I talked about some papers about the impact of intelligence capabilities and how they affect security. But there are a few other broad areas. One broad area that I'm currently working on is the economic impact of, let's say, terrorism. And those are some empirical papers. So the big question is, we know that there is a lot of concern about terrorism, but the question is, does terrorism really matter to the economy? And there are actually two papers I'm working on over there. So one is we are looking at the OECD countries, And we are asking the question, well, if you for the OECD countries, was there any reason to believe that terrorism had a major impact on their GDP per capita? There is another paper that I'm working on where we are looking at the impact of terrorism on, let's say, investments in education. So as we talked about early in this talk, that there is a fear that money can be diverted from education. So we are trying to quantitatively find out how big that impact is. And there is a third paper that also we are, just thinking of right now. So it is about domestic terrorism in the United States. So how big that is and what is the impact of that on the economy. So, but this third project, we are just talking about it. So haven't really done the work for that one.
Great. I like that you're telling us about empirical studies, because I think for a lot of us, these theoretical models, are interesting. But when we talk about research with relevance, it's really okay. Now let's see how it's applied. I want to ask you about the second one in particular. What are the data sets that one could use to estimate that impact on investments in education?
Yes, so essentially you will have to combine several kinds of data sets. So one is if you want to know about terrorist attacks, then the most commonly used database is called the Global Terrorism Database. It is published by a center called START. It's run by the University of Maryland at College Park. And it's open source data, so anyone can access it. You just have to register with them and you get the data. So that is one. And then there are a few other data sets also that are gradually getting published. So one is called the ACLED data set, ACLED. So I forget the full form of that, but it is also a new data set that is being used. And other than the information on terrorist attacks, you will also need information on the economy. Fortunately, you can get a lot of information on, let's say, on the economies of different countries from the World Bank. So they have made all of those things publicly available in their website. You just have to, download those data sets. So I will say that World Bank, along with Global Terrorism Database, that will that that will cover most of the variables you might be interested in. And then there are a few other variables you might need, say stuff on, civil liberties or press freedom or those kinds of stuff. You can get that information from some of the think tanks like Freedom House.
So do you end up doing a time series analysis?
Usually panel data.
Okay. And is that the same? Is that also true for the domestic terrorism study that you're planning?
Well, for the domestic terrorism study, we'll probably have to do more of a time series because it is about the United States. But again, what we would like to see is if we can get enough information at the state level. If we get good information at the state level, then we can also use panel data techniques for that. But if not, then if it is information for the entire country only, then we'll probably have to go for time series.
And how do you handle just the definition of terrorism and domestic terrorism in particular? Because isn't there some political controversy on how we're even defining those terms?
Yes. So the point is, there is a commonly accepted definition of terrorism that was made by two other economists, and usually most of the databases follow their definition. So basically for something so the big question is, how do you distinguish a terrorist attack from, let's say, a normal criminal attack? So a terrorist attack must have certain kinds of, special features, such as one of the motivations should be to create a climate of fear. Then normally it should be done by some non-state actor and so on. So they identified some criteria. And what the Global Terrorism Database does is they do have lots of researchers who sort of look at the attributes of every attack and They check whether the attributes match with the definition. If yes, then they classify it as a terrorist attack. Otherwise, they don't. But they give us the entire data set, that includes both criminal activities as well as terrorist attacks. But they leave all of the information inside the database so that if we want to use the commonly accepted definition, we can filter our, numbers appropriately.
Great. All right. Well, we are just about at the end. Any last questions coming in? I don't see any. Super interesting work. Very proud to have you here at KSU, Dr. Bagchi. I think just such a timely topic, strong, robust quantitative methods. Really thankful that you joined us today.
Thank you for hosting me today.
Again, I want to say thank you to Megan, who helped with the video, also to Heather Hedgepeth, who does all sorts of logistics for our office, and to share with you that the next Chairs and Directors Showcase will be on April 1st at 11 a.m. and we will be featuring Dr. Marcia Barsky, who is Chair of the Department of Dance in the College of the Arts, and she will be discussing research on somatic-based learning in dance. Wow, that sounds pretty darn interesting. So stay tuned for more information in the coming weeks by visiting our Office of Research website. And with that, I'm going to say have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, healthy, happy, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Bye-bye.